Hey everybody, welcome back to another season of Being Unapologetically Authentic with your host, Jean Tian. That's me. In this season, we are exploring the intersectionality of authenticity with an ethnic flair and success. I am so excited to be able to provide this platform to bring on the voices of Asian Americans, particularly Asian American females, so that they can share their stories of how they have overcome social and cultural conditioning, as well as their own personal stories in order to find their own success. This is a super powerful season. I cannot wait for you guys to hear their stories. I am breaking down cultural norms for you. Let's get started. Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for joining me on another episode of Being Unapologetically Authentic. And I have a very special guest today. Her name is Cat Fan, and she is the author of Mika's, and I swore I remember the name of this. Hold on a second. Sorry. Mika's Quest for the Lost Artifact. Sorry about that. So it is a children's book, and I am so pleased to have her here because I think her story is so amazing, and I think a lot of people will resonate with it. So welcome, Kat, to the show.
Thank you, Jean. Thanks so much for having me.
Absolutely. I am so happy to have you here because you have a very unique story, one that I think a lot of our listeners will resonate with, and I think one that they will truly be inspired by because of all that you have achieved in your life so far, and you're still so young. So there's still so much more to do. So I'd love for you to take this opportunity to share a little bit about your background and about yourself with our listeners.
Yes. So I am a daughter of Vietnamese refugees. I'm also a first generation immigrant to ever first go to college. And my upbringing really was in Stockton, which is, if anyone's familiar with the area, Stockton, California, is more of a lower social demographic city that is more ridden with poverty and crime and gangs. And so I primarily grew up there. And once my parents were able to, they had actually uprooted us and moved us over to Tracy, California, which is like about an hour drive away, but it ended up being like an extremely strong community around farming and agriculture. And so moving from like a very ethnic enclave location to a farming town where it's primarily Caucasian and whatnot. But yeah, so just adjusted to that, and then eventually had made my way and went to school at UC Davis. My undergrad was in Asian American Studies and sociology minor, and then pursued my master's in organization development at San Francisco Unified School District. And while working at San Francisco Unified School District, but that was at University of San Francisco. But I've made my journey and worked on the public sector for about a decade before moving over to work in private for the financial fintech, as well as like all of major tech companies.
That's amazing. And what I really love about, because I was actually just scrolling over to your bio just to make sure that I had this correct. And for those of you who are on listening, you will get a link to check out Kat's bio along with her book. And we'll talk about the book in a little bit. But what I really wanted to dig into was this part in your bio where you said that you felt that, people found it hard to see past your ethnicity, past the fact that you and your family are Vietnamese, and I think maybe even the refugee aspect had came in. And was that particularly true in Stockton, or was that more of the area in terms of like the farming area? And how did that impact your childhood growing up in terms of how you saw yourself as well?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's very important to kind of think through the societal pieces that we grow up in and really learn to adjust or survive, right? I would say when I was growing up, in Stockton, coming from being a refugee family that had nothing. My parents worked all day and all night, and I was the oldest. You know, I did go through terms where by the time I went to college, I felt like I was stripped of my childhood. At a really young age, I had to learn to grow very fast. I was the oldest in my family. Um, I already had started working by the time I was 5 years old to help support the family business. And so that kind of gives a different type of perspective, and really has molded me to like how I am now. I think I am extremely open-minded because I understand what it's like to come from different walks of life. um, and for example, like our family lived off of like Kentucky Fried Chicken and rice, or like top ramen with chicken wings. Like it just, because we had a large family. There were six of us. There's four siblings, four of us total. And I think like because of that immigrant type of mentality, my parents like working really hard to scrape up anything they can. Um, we were different, and other kids notice. And living in a community that was a very big ethnic enclave, but because there's like poverty and crime and everyone trying to figure themselves out, we got bullied a lot. We got beat up a lot. I remember it as a kid. I'm constantly being chased from the moment the bus driver drops us off. I'm ready to sprint to get to my house, because there would be older kids or kids that were much stronger, that would pick on us because we were different. And my parents worked really hard, but we couldn't afford clothes or new shoes or whatnot. So my mom like made a lot of our clothes. You could totally we stood out. Um, my younger brother was a year younger, and he stood out as well. And so I think being a boy was really tough in the community growing up. And at that time, he had a disability or a deformity that he was born with. And that, growing up in like even just from elementary school, kindergarten, first grade, and second grade, you already know that you have to be very strong because we were picked on and bullied a lot. Yeah, so I think that's kind of like how I would say the experience is very different. And then you would think that like by moving and being uprooted from one area to a predominantly farming town, which is much safer, um, would make things a lot better. And it did, I think, in terms of safety wise. But then we really understood what it was like to feel discriminated and stereotyped being the only Asian family in that town. It's a predominantly Caucasian community with Hispanic and Mexican like immigrant workers. And so like, but the opening for it was I actually learned to be pretty fluent in Spanish at a young age, working at our parents' store. But we were always called like La China or Los Chinas and stuff, and just derogatory terms. And then seeing customers that we had a family store, but see customers like be very condescending to my parents, or say very obnoxious, egregious, or racist things to them. So like I think like my eyes were open really wide, by the time I've made through elementary school. So my mindset was different than other kids. I didn't have sleepovers or attended a lot of birthday parties and whatnot. I really cared about doing whatever I can to help my parents at a really young age so that we can sustain.
Your story resonates in so many ways with mine. I think being immigrants, right, and being the children of recent immigrants, recent in the sense that like our parents are not even, I mean, I'm not even a first generation. I was born in Taiwan and my parents were born outside of the US too. And like some of the stories that you just shared definitely like brought back memories of getting bullied, getting picked on. And, it fuels a certain something within us. And I don't know if you feel that way, although it sounds like you do, in terms of fueling ourselves to, it became the fuel to do more, to do better. And it almost like it hurt. It definitely hurt. There's no doubt about like the pain and kind of um, you know, the disappointment, I guess, or the sadness of feeling like the outcast, right? But at the same time, you know, it kind of like forced us to go within and to find that strength from within, which I think is so amazing. And so I wanted to ask, how have these experiences fueled your desire to be who you are today and to succeed, for lack of a more defined term?
It definitely has. Fueling that fire or that spark or that ignition that you mentioned, I have a strong sense of it. So over the years growing up and going through college and learning about, I actually came into college as a pre-veterinarian chemistry and animal science major. Within the first week, I discovered Asian American studies and just completely switched majors. Because I was like, why didn't we learn this in school? Why didn't I learn this growing up? There's actually history in America that like there were strong representations of Asian Americans, that we weren't like just um, migrant workers or building the railroad. And I just felt this strong sense of like, what can I do to make an impact to the community? And if there is just even one person that I can uplift or help make their life better than what mine was, that is to me like feels like a life calling. And I think all of these positive outcomes that comes out of me is like I grew up in a sense where I can really make business decisions by a very young age. I know how to negotiate. I know how to work through the government and navigate those pieces because I help translation and figure out services for my parents. And I think like all of those areas that I look back deeply grounds me and keeps me rooted to like what it is that I'm doing and why. And how can I always come back to what has set me to want to do more and better. I think for me, it's like, you know, for example, like when I had graduated Davis, actually was in lobbying. I was a third house and working in Sacramento, I was always the shortest, the brownest, the only woman, the youngest in a committee of legislators, lobbyists, legislative aides. And I remember sitting in a room with all white males, very old, and we were talking about California's policy on Medi-Cal. And I had shared experiences about how it has really helped the communities and people I know that were able to use it to help them sustain and survive so that they can break that cycle. And this man looks at me in the eye and goes, well, who are you to, you know, give weight into how we do California policy? You are just sharing examples from your experiences. Whereas I like worked at Ground Zero, I worked at Compton Unified School District. I did this and I helped build policy. And, you know, and then I was like, okay, fine. I will like I'll come back to you. And I think for me, like it lights this like I'm going to prove you wrong and prove others otherwise to be better and to come out stronger. And I think at the end of the day, when other people understand and see all the potential barriers and roadblocks that you have in your life, where people will just give you permission to give up, and you don't, and for me, it's like, you know, no one would be the wiser if I just said like, hey, this is my life, this is the bubble, this is what I was born in. And instead I was like questioning it, pushing it, poking it. And then I went to go get my master's in organization development and worked at San Francisco Unified School District for 6 years, and worked on those policies. And I didn't make my way back to legislation and working at the state level, but it was just more of me thinking of like, I can do better, I can do more, and I need to do more at a path that I'm creating for myself. And I think like with all of these experiences, that sense of resilience, um, there are moments where I have my very low times and I feel very isolated. There's moments where I like question what I'm doing. And I think it does make me stronger. It makes me very human. And it also makes me very empathetic to other people.
Yeah, and I love this. I just love everything that you shared, because what's policy if it doesn't influence or impact the people that it's supposed to impact, right? So, but that aside, maybe a general gripe against politicians in general. But anyway, but what I really love the fact that you shared was this aspect of how you've leveraged your authenticity. You've leveraged who you are as your fuel to do better and to uplift. And it's that, and when listening to your story, your authenticity, your experiences are it's that one underlying theme across everything that you've done. It's that one thing that guides your decisions, in terms of, how to move forward. And I think that that is so powerful for the listeners and for the audience and for others too, because it, by staying true to yourself, you're able to really just, in the dark times, in the times where you're not sure, like that is the fuel that you go back to. That is like the foundation of the resilience that we can all use in order to keep ourselves going, right? Because the days aren't always easy. And I think that's the biggest misconception out there too, is that, oh, if you follow your passion, if you follow your purpose, things will be easy. No, it's not. It's actually probably even harder than to follow like societal norms, because most of the time you're going against norms. You're standing up to the policy, like the Caucasian, middle-aged Caucasian male policymaker that's like asking you and challenging you, like, who are you to say anything, right? Like, I know better than you. But I just love everything that you just shared with us, because of the fact that it's proof of how important authenticity is for us to be able to move forward in the way that we're meant to move forward, especially for those of us who are out there looking to create a world that's different than what we've been given, right?
Mhm. Yeah, and I think like with the authenticity pieces, like finding that voice and like speaking up to question, maybe I'm not confrontational, right? And so I think like there's different ways that it can be portrayed, and there's different ways to find a vehicle for showcasing or putting yourself out there. um the authenticity pieces is like when you're able or want to or have a desire to just show up as you are, people are reflective of it. And as much as I had um you know roadblocks and barriers, there were so many other people that were like, wow, like this is, your mindset is amazing, like how can I help you? Or this viewpoint of what you're trying to do makes a lot of sense, like how do we get there? And I think that's what it starts bringing on real conversations about promoting change and like change movement, um, from either the ground level or just to within companies that I have worked with over the years.
Yeah, and I'm so glad you mentioned that too, because one of the questions that came to mind too is that as you've kind of have had both experiences in the public and in the private sector, right? From your perspective, how, are we there yet for Asian American females, right? Or even Asian females or Asian, females of Asian with Asian descent? Like, are we there yet in terms of being where we need to be, in terms of being heard and seen as I don't want to say equals because I don't think we're ever equals, but as part of like an inclusive environment, and what from your perspective and from your experiences is left for there to do, and what can we as Asian American females do to help ourselves?
Mhm. Yeah, I think this is a very important question that it's one of the questions that keeps me up at night and I contemplate over and over. As much as there has been great strides in the Asian American females in the workplace or in the public sector workplace, there is still room for improvement. There are sense, like for my sense of like intuitional gut feeling of whether or not the environment is receptive or open to it. I think the value that I've brought is that diversity of thought, like the one that's questioning or asking, why do we do it this way? And that has really reaffirmed those like that sense to others that it's important to like have a seat at the table. The other piece is like if you don't have a seat at the table, then you bring your chair there. The one of the other areas that I think is a huge gap is like for Asian American women or just Asian Americans or just Asians overall, working very closely and allying with other groups. It is very, you would expect to see that, but I actually don't see that a lot. I reach out to people out in the workplace, from where I work right now, and even in my career to reach out. Like it is scary to have that in the climate that we work on, but I'll reach out like, hey, you are also like within that marginalized demographic, whether or not you want to represent it or be a spokesperson, but like let's collaborate, let's partner together. What are your issues? What are your concerns? How can I amplify it? And I go and seek that out and make a very deliberate intentional effort, um, across the communities. And it could be, and that's where like I think you hear about the synchronization of like the Latinx communities, the African American communities, the LGBTQ, disability. Like I myself have disabilities. They are not as open for other people to see. And I think like reaching out to create those type of communities and support network with each other and like across, and viewing like, okay, the like Latina and the Black ad communities, like they were able to move this movement, like how can we collaborate together? And I think that's where there's a lot of room in for career to life to just like, I guess, going in arms, with the work that we do, regardless if it is work for social justice or like basic human rights.
It's almost like we have to show how it's done, right? We can't just keep talking about the necessity for it to be done, but we have to show others how it's done. And it's so interesting too, in the sense that it feels like this Herculean task, right? Of merging all of the minorities together and being on the same plane. And I I think though that at the end of the day, I we all have our own challenges, but it's so difficult to say, and it's so unnecessary. Like I think there's this competition of who's had it worse, but
Yeah.
at this point in our society, in our culture, in our lives, like I don't think it matters anymore. And the more that we focus on who's had it worse, the harder it is for us to be able to move forward to create a more inclusive environment. Because if we keep bashing each other, because there's this myth out there, the model minority myth, right? There is this myth that Asian Americans are doing so well, and compared to some of the other minorities, and so they all hate on us. But if you look at the facts, we're actually not doing as well as I think it's portrayed out there. And there's a reason certain things are portrayed the way that they are, because it creates this divisive attitude against each other. and we can't come together. So imagine if we were, and I think about this all the time too, it's like, imagine if we just all just drop the BS, right? And then we focus on like, all right, we're not each other's enemies. Maybe at a later point we can be. But right now, like, I don't think we are. There's only really one, and it's not a common enemy, but there's a common goal that we have in terms of seeking the representation, seeking the inclusion, seeking a true diversity, right? And I think to your point, the diversity is not just diversity of skin color or ethnicities, but the diversity of thought, the diversity of backgrounds, which you had brought to the table, but then it was dismissed because other people didn't have it, and to them it didn't exist, right? So it's there's so much work we all have to do, but we can't do it alone. Like, we have to do it together.
Yeah.
And as you were talking, that I've been binge watching Netflix's Partner Track. I don't know if you've heard of it or have seen it. Have you seen it? It's actually pretty good. I highly recommend it. It's a fun watch. And so, but it's based off of this book written by Helen Wan called also Partner Track. And the main character is a Taiwanese American lawyer who's in this predominantly white environment in a law firm trying to make partner, and this concept of her having to work even harder than her colleagues, right? And the microaggressions that come, but you can't prove it because our society and the policies that create, this anti-harassment, anti-discrimination workplace, they don't even touch on microaggressions. You can't even begin to prove it because people don't even believe or know that it exists. Yeah. And, I think her, if I read it correctly, her inspiration came from her experiences as a first year law student. So I wanted to ask you, what was your inspiration for writing Mika's quest for the lost artifacts?
Yeah. I think like in social media, we do tend to look at like TV shows and movies, and that is where a lot of people find resemblances of themselves, right? Growing up, and try to like determine like your sense in the world. For me, it had always been to books, because I didn't have access to cable and TV growing up. And my parents were also really strict, like first generation Catholic. And so I was very, um, I felt like I was a hermit. And so what they were very open to was reading and books. And so that's where I found my avenue. Um, Moving towards like coming in, like into an author type of journey is really interesting. But I think I've just found it as like a really important vehicle as an exposure for children. I myself have three younger kids, and I just think of like for the future of my kids, what do I want, right? Like I want them to have to feel psychological safety in school, to be able to share their idea. I want them to feel included and not feel so different. I think like just all of the things that I had experienced, like I'm hoping will be better for them. And so, and looking back as the child that I was growing up, like I had wished, like, you read in yourself and these main characters, and you're like, that would be so amazing if I was like this person. But I actually never even put myself in the same line of thought, because I was just like, that doesn't even comprehend that I can be a main character in my own life or in my story, just because of how like the cultural upbringing pieces. Um, and so that's where I moved into the journey of like exposing children into books, and the even my career trajectory working from the San Francisco School District to lobbying and education, and then moving into tech, and now doing a lot of work with like diversity inclusion and demystifying technology for like just globally, like all of that connected the dots to kind of made sense for me to go into books for children, and hoping that exposure is there. So I hope I answered the question correctly, but
Yeah.
I know there's like so many different themes and so much to unpack with just one question.
Yeah, sorry. I tend to ask complicated multi questions in one. Um, Tell us a little bit about the book. Who is Mika? What is she searching for? How did she get started? And what was there a particular event or experience that prompted you to write this story in particular? And then are you looking to create more stories?
Mhm. Yeah, I think so for me, Mika's Quest came about with this idea of like having a strong female character. And yes, we've seen books on that, but there was a gap actually for early readers chapter books that was very that picked up in terms of popularity in the last couple of years, with I think with a mix of like Black Lives Matters and Stop Asian Hate. A lot of self-published authors were able to really amplify their picture books, and we're starting to see that, and I love it. I love seeing that. And then but then like you hit the ages when you try to seek for books around like the 5 6 year old up to 8 to 9 year olds, and there's actually a huge gap. And that's, I feel like that age range is so important because that's the age when I already had noticed that I was different than others. And I think like, so it was important for me to gear specifically early readers chapter books because that's when you get a sense of your identity. That's when you're like noticing the differences between people and you're asking these questions and you're trying to figure out how you see yourself in this world and how other people see you. The idea of like being really good friends, making good friends, or so and so doesn't want to be my friend, like that age, and like just like natural attraction and crushes and whatnot. And I think it was so important to have, you know, using literature or books as a vehicle to have conversations for kids. And that's where Mika's Quest really had derivative out of. It was just this idea of like, okay, a female protagonist, but like, do we ever see someone, the Asians minor minority myth is like really light skinned Asians, and those that are not in the community don't even understand or know that this understanding of like darker skin and caste systems per se of like there's like the higher level Asians and then the lower level like Southeast Asians. And so I really wanted to see like a character that was a darker skinned Asian. And let's throw in the mixed race aspect because we live in America and a lot of Asian Americans are intermingling and mix and marrying outside of their ethnicities. And it was important for me to like bring in those type of conversation and weaving it through the storytelling. But the biggest piece is like, how do we weave it in so it's subtle, so it's interesting and engaging to kids? Because like adults, if it's something that's just being thrown at you, you're gonna be turned off to it. But weaving it as like, this is just a character and it's, normalizing that image on the bookshelves, but at the same time it speaks volume in the subtlety of itself, and that's kind of like where this series had started. And book one is coming out this year. I just finished book two and starting the production and illustration of it, and then now I'm drafting book three, which I'm really excited about because it's just like trying to weave in more diversity inclusivity of like foods, location, people, and weaving in like real history, but making it enchanting and fun, so that kids care about learning about history, and care about like understanding the world around them. Because like when I talk to my niece and nephews that are in for second and third grade, they're like, history is boring. It's like I had to memorize like the dates of like Abraham Lincoln, and it's like a multiple choice, and I don't really care. And going back to like by the time I was in college to discover there's actually Asian American history and Chicano studies and all of this, I'm like, oh my gosh, there's this whole world, right? And so like weaving real facts and information into these books, but it's actually like a novel and stories. And so that was a big piece of it. And as these series and books progress, for me to connect with people throughout the community that actually are living those experiences and build those characters. So, for example, like the third book, I'm connecting with someone that is actually grew up with blindness, and to talk about like to learn more about that experience, because I want to be able to have a character that Mika befriends in her journey, in her quest of whatever she's seeking, but introducing in different dynamics, so that when kids are reading it with their parents or teachers or caregivers, they can ask these questions, and it also allows parents to have questions too. And yeah.
Yeah, and one of the things too, there's a couple of things in there that you mentioned too. And one of them is I think you had posted somewhere, you had shared somewhere that the children's books aren't necessarily for just the children as well, that the story is just as impactful, if not more so, for adults, right? Because to what you had said earlier, it's not something that's thrown in their face, but it's a seed that's planted that causes them to think about the current status, about the way that they've been conditioned in terms of their beliefs about Asians and whatever else.
Yes, exactly. And so, there's I would imagine this book, like as it's being read, from a librarian to a classroom of kids, that like maybe the librarian in like Kansas are find exposure and learn about like, oh, okay, like the word mija means like an endearing way of saying like daughter, in Spanish, or like the types of food. And I think it's really critical for adults too. Myself as a mom, I read to my kids every night, and I read the same books over and over. And so for me, it's like finally like being able to find books, that we can read, that we can also find interest in, and also like the sacred time with my kids to be able for them to ask questions. I read
Yeah.
with my daughter and she'll be like, well, why did this character do this, or like, is there really mermaids, and you're just having these conversations, or like, oh, or why does this like um this boy have a family with like two moms, and we'll have like that conversation of blended families or foster care. We talk about that too. And so I think like weaving it in, the parents and the adults that are reading it are exposed to it to have these conversations, as well as like children that are exposed to it, which we try to be deliberate with parts where people, depending on where people live.
I love that. And then, one of the other things that you had also mentioned too was this aspect of colorism within the Asian rate, within the Asian demographics. And, I think it's so interesting because I was actually just having a conversation with one of our friends who's Caucasian, also elderly male. But he was just surprised. He never knew that it existed, right? And, and what had shocked me was something recently that had happened. And it was with people of our own generation. Like we kind of can understand people of the older generation. They were brought up different. They were, like, but then a comment made, that just fell a lot in line with this whole colorism aspect against peers, like it just kind of threw me off guard. So the fact is, it's still like all of these things, even though we know better, it still exists within our DNA to a certain extent. And to what you were saying earlier, it is absolutely time to break the cycle. And it's amazing that you can use the books to help to do that and have those conversations. And at the same time, instill pride within our children for being different, right? Because I think so many times they don't see that because we're so immersed in this white culture of everything that's awesome is related to that culture, and everything that's not is somehow related to the minority culture of some sort. And so I think this representation that starts at the young age to instill pride, to, instill a greater awareness of what their culture is like, especially as, our grandparents or our parents get older, a lot of that tends to fall aside too, right? So I love the multi-purpose aspect of what you're doing through these children's books because I do believe that, to empower our youth is absolutely a critical step to really changing the world.
Yeah. And I'm excited about it. I think it'll be really amazing to like build curriculum or provide activity sheets and worksheets for each
Yeah.
of the grade levels, where like educators have access to tap into it, or if it's counselors or psychiatrists, and as they're anyone that works with children and even adults, it's like we naturally inherently want to have a better world for our future, and so you're more likely going to be open to these real conversations.
Yeah.
The other piece of it is like all cultures, whether like the like Latino community or the Asian communities or the Black communities, like we don't have these type of like deeper conversations with our parents sometimes, just because of generational and culturally and what's natural and normal. And so this kind of drives it, that opens that playing field to have the conversation. Like for my parents, I've always wished to have these questions and to be able to learn from them and learn about what their experiences were like. But for them, they're very much bottled up because of like the trauma or their experiences, or like just the literacy pieces. And so the hope is that like we can have these like real authentic conversations, and even in this the school realm, or even outside of, within the community. And even for adults, like I talk to my friends, like for example, like right now I have a really good friend, and he just looks like, white America, Caucasian, and has the name, and it's very like, basically like almost as an Andrew Smith. But when you actually talk to him and stuff, he's like, yeah, he's like, no one would know that actually our family is like Latin American, and we are actually just lighter skin, and I lived in extreme poverty. And I was like, you would never know just looking to him. But using that, like he's like, but then because I of this, I understand. And so if I see something, I use what I can pass by to like protect others or help others or say something, because if I say something, that privilege, someone will take a step back and say like, hey, I'm sorry, but and then the other piece is that it just adds to the conversations. We already learn the regular academics in our livelihoods, and I think like weaving in coping mechanism, growth mindset, these leadership skills that we learn growing up into these stories about like overcoming resilience, trying something new. It has all of the characteristics and themes that any adult would or parent would want to share with their kids. And so for me, it's like making it subtle and multi-purpose enough, that it can be adapted to mainstream, but at the same time, there's a deeper underlying of conversations that you could have if you wanted to dig deeper.
I love that. I love it. I can't wait for the second and third book to come out. And before we go into the closing of this discussion, which has been just fabulous, and I even let us like run over time because normally I close in 30 minutes, but this has been such an important conversation to have. I wanted to just keep going. But before we go, number one, what is your definition of success?
My definition of success is to eventually find a place where you feel very comfortable and happy in your own skin. And whatever that topic it is that drives you, naturally brings you to whatever internal motivators that drive you. It's so, for example, like the old school version would be like, oh, success, like being a dentist and you own a firm and it has to tie in with wealth. But growing for me, like breaking out of that mold, dentist or medical engineer, lawyer for Asian Americans, it's like really hard to break. But success really is like finding that inner peace, that and finding what is your life calling is success. I think for even for myself, like I didn't have a direct route that made sense. Like I like love, you know, policy and law, but I didn't move into the lawyer route. And then I questioned myself. I was like pre-vet, but I didn't move into the pre-vet route, in like more of the medical side. And I think like I've always like felt like I didn't add it up enough or was inadequate. I think, and it's not until my mid 30s that I was like looking back that to me success is like whatever is that life calling, like it will naturally bring others in the community to you. Um, and you can still continue to do that in the work that you do. And so hopefully that answers it. It's not, I think a lot of the answers that is philosophical and ideologically is it depends.
Totally understand. And there's no right or wrong answer. It's always just up to you. And then finally, how can people get a copy of the first book that you have out, which is the Quest for Lost Artifacts?
Yes. So Mika's Quest for the Lost Artifact is available online through www.mikasquest.com. I have a website there that will be sending out updates. I would love for folks to just join the quest and subscribe. But yeah, you can find your first copy there, and hoping to get as into the hands of as many readers as possible for this year too.
I love it. And Kat, I definitely want to buy a book and I want it autographed because I cannot wait to see what you come up with next. So
Thank
if that
you.
could be possible, I'd love that.
Yes, yes.
Awesome. Awesome. Thank you so much for being a guest on my show today. And thank you to the audience for joining us. This was such an important conversation. So I hope you enjoyed it as much as I have. And we'll see you guys next time. Bye, everybody.